Hello, this is Nick Clegg, and thank you very much for listening to this, my new podcast. You might be surprised about my first guest in the first episode. It's Nigel Farage, and I think you could hardly find two people who disagree with each other more on pretty well everything than me and Nigel Farage. But much though I disagree with him, I still think it's important to be able to talk to people you disagree with, however strongly you disagree with them. And the first part of the podcast, it's Nigel Farage talking about his life. It's not really me cross-questioning him. For those who want to hear us locking horns more on the issues of the day, that comes later in the podcast. I hope you find it interesting and enjoyable.
Angry feelings are disagreeable.
I'm putting you on warning.
Just who the hell do you think you people are?
They will be met with fire and fury.
They make you act and look as well as feel unhappy.
Our very way of life
Look at the fear.
are under threats from extremists.
I am your voice.
This is Anger Management with Nick Clegg, and the recurrent theme in this series of podcasts is that rage is the opposite of reason. Discuss. My personal view is that too much rage and too little reason is not good for the world, but this is the kind of thing I want to discuss with my guests. And today I have a stellar guest who, how can I put this, is extremely well qualified to talk about the politics of anger, Nigel Farage. Nigel, good morning.
Good morning. And you're right, I am very well qualified to talk about rage and anger and violence too.
Oh, right.
Because I've been subjected to more of it than any figure in modern British political history.
Yes, I think that's a claim. I mean, well, we'll come on to that actually, because if from completely opposite directions, we've courted a fair amount of controversy from our critics. And but by the way, I just thought I'd say one thing which amused me immensely. When I read that when we, before our second TV duel in 2000, let's gloss over for a minute who won that one. But I read that you didn't drink in preparation for that. You didn't drink for four whole days. You went walking on the North Downs and even had a few morning swims. I'm assuming you haven't gone through this terrible preparation this time round.
No, I really haven't, I promise you.
The street.
No, well, it's right. Well, it was very interesting, isn't it? You know, as you know, when you're doing those big set-piece debates, and particularly now with TV cameras, with HD, the heat on those platforms. So they all said, when we did the first debate...
Yes, you sweated too much.
...that I was very sweaty. And, of course, I come straight from the Westminster Arms, is the truth.
Yes. So I waved my arms too much, apparently.
I decided that wasn't going to happen again.
Right. So, well, you can wave your arms to your heart's content. I'll start with something which might be counterintuitive, which is counterintuitive to both of us and maybe people listening as well, which is that I actually think we have a lot more in common than many people might imagine. I mean, we're both educated at public schools in London. We both spent most of our careers in politics. We were both MEPs at the same time. I remember once having a drink while you were there in the Aviateur pub.
Oh, that nightclub, yes.
Yeah.
God, that was fun, wasn't it?
We've both led kind of insurgent parties, I guess, in different ways. We both have European wives. We both have children who speak more than one language. And yet, of course, our worldviews are very different. So what I'd like to know is, how did you develop the views that you have done during the course of your life?
Well, you've missed something.
Okay.
You've missed something quite major that does differentiate us in a big, big way, which is I left school, bypassed university,
straight to the city.
Because there was this big boom going on.
This was when? This was
in 82 that I did this. And so I spent 20 years working in the commodities business. Not a banker, but buying and selling copper, aluminium, stuff like that. And the last 9 years of that, running my own company. And I think that has had a very major impact on my political views. Because, when I left school, sure, I was very interested in politics. I thought the Thatcher Revolution was incredibly exciting. Painful too, but incredibly exciting. But it was really... I was never even going to stand for local councillor. I had no intentions of being involved in current affairs, but it was my experience in business more than anything else that got me into politics.
And that ran in the family, if I understand it. So your dad was in the city, your brother was in the city, so you're quite sort of city family,
yeah,
right?
My grandfather was 50 years on the stock exchange, so yeah, we've been stockbrokers. I went a slightly different route, doing commodities, and one of the things I liked...
And your brother, he was also...
Brother was in commodities too, and one of the things I loved about commodities is it was a truly global market. There was total free trade in commodities, in metals. Other than if you imported aluminium into the European Union, then of course there was a 7% tariff. So I very early on took the view that we had a really very fortunate, lucky place in the world. Not only did we speak English, but we had a great merchanting tradition that had gone back for centuries, but also being stuck there in the middle of the world's time zone. So, in the morning, you spoke to the Australians, and
you spoke the global language,
and by lunchtime you're talking to the Americans. And so I kind of took the view that what we were doing on the London Metal Exchange was actually a model for what the rest of the country ought to be doing.
If I may, I want to come back to that, because I want to come back to that kind of idea of a buccaneering, sort of swashbuckling global Britain. But just on you for a minute, before we get into the sort of heavier duty sort of stuff later. But if that was where you were clearly very happy and doing well, when was the switch flicked? When did you? Was there a Damascene moment? So, for instance, if I look back at my time because I actually took a different trajectory to you, but I wasn't actually wildly interested in politics at university, and after I left, or certainly not party politics. The collapse of the Berlin Wall in *89 had a huge impact on me in the way I kind of saw the world. Was there a moment? Was there a person? I've read somewhere did you give Powell a lift in your car?
That was in the 90s.
That much later. Okay,
that was in the 90s, and we'll
come to that later.
We'll come to that because it's quite a fun little story. But during the late 1980s, I began to be concerned about the European single market. That act went through Parliament in 1986.
The Single European Act,
yeah. And I began to think, what the blazes is going on here? Because, sure, when the phone rang, it could be Paris, it could be Frankfurt, but actually in the game I was in, it was more likely to be Singapore or Santiago. So I began to become concerned. I then saw a whole lot of legislation coming into the marketplace, making it more expensive and more difficult to do business. And I asked myself the question, where is all this coming from? And I realised actually it was a series of European directives. Now, that of itself didn't have to be a bad thing, but I began to question, why is the establishment in Britain so hell-bent on a European destiny for us? And if you remember, in the late 80s, there was a very big debate. Should we or should we not join the exchange rate mechanism? Should we effectively peg sterling? Well, they say against the basket of currencies, but really the Deutschmark. I mean, that's the truth of it. And I was very, very vociferous in thinking that was an absolutely mad idea. I felt the UK economy more services orientated, the German economy more manufacturing. Different stages of the economic cycle. And it was October 1990. It was about 5:30 in the evening. I'd had a miserable day. I'd lost money. I was in a very bad mood. I was in the pub, and because in those days you didn't have screens everywhere, and the mobile phone was really in its infancy. And somebody ran in and said, "It's just been announced. We're joining the exchange rate mechanism." Well, I won't tell you what I said initially, but it's pretty Anglo-Saxon.
Might have started with F.
And that kind of thing. And the next morning, I'm travelling up on the train from Kent.
Which is where you've always lived, right?
Yeah, I have. Yeah, I mean, I'm still living in the same village in which I was born, and that gives me a very good grounding, actually, in this in a game. Because if I walk into the local pub on a Sunday or go to church, no one bats an eyelid. No one asks me questions.
No, heaven knows when you're ever there. You seem to be leading a globe-trotting life.
Well, yeah, but I still get home occasionally.
Anyway.
I still get home occasionally. Anyway, I was travelling up the next morning on train, and I read that the Tory party supported ERM, the Lib Dems supported ERM, the Labour Party supported ERM, the CBI supported ERM, the TUC supported ERM, and every single newspaper editorial. One or two asked questions, but basically there was a total consensus.
So your experience in the commodities market, setting aside for a minute whether that's a wholly representative window on the rest of the British economy. But anyway, I don't want to sort of rile you too much at this stage. But the ERM, that's very interesting. So the ERM really was a big catalyst for you.
Yeah, and I saw this consensus saying that it was the right thing to do. And I sat there thinking, no, I don't buy this.
And your attitudes towards the Conservative Party were interesting. Because I have to say to you, I, of course, saw in a completely different context how much you successfully totally freaked out the high command of the Conservative Party.
Gosh,
I mean, we'll come to that in a minute. I think in many ways, when the history books are written, I mean, you might dispute this, but I think your greatest achievement, oddly enough, was well before the referendum was held, was by basically bullying and harrying the Conservative Party so much they decided to hold the referendum. But anyway, we'll come to that in a second.
Yeah.
But were you a natural conservative? I mean, you come from quite a conservative sort of background, right?
Do you know, I thought I was a natural conservative.
But was it at that moment that you thought, no, I don't want to have any more truck with them?
But I realised, actually, I'm not a conservative at all. If I go back through history, And I think, which side of the argument would I have been on the corn laws? Which side of the argument would I have been on appeasement? Which side of the argument would I have been on a whole host of things? In fact, there are only very short periods of time when I would naturally have found myself at home in the land-owning Conservative Party.
Right.
Right. So, I mean, to be honest with you, and this is a word that perhaps has lost its meaning, but I would really describe myself as more of a radical liberal in many ways.
Oh, heavens above.
No,
Nigel, we're going to have we're going to have a semantic tug of war now.
But you see, Nick,
no.
In the past, liberals believed genuinely in individual liberty. Now they want to ban everything.
You're talking about sort of Manchester, sort of 19th century Manchester liberalism.
That's what I'm talking about, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, well, can I just... You mentioned you started by making the point, a perfectly valid one, about in terms of the politics of anger. You've been subject to as much anger as you arguably have generated yourself. I mean, I don't talk about this that much, and neither do you. But it's tough on families. It's very tough on families. You've got somebody in your family who's being sort of torn limb from limb. I mean, and you might not want to say very much, but has it been difficult for your kids and so on?
Well, of course, because look, the position that I took from that morning on the train when I disagreed with the consensus view on the exchange rate mechanism, I have taken an anti-establishment position. And when you take on the establishment and you threaten the status quo, they don't exactly walk out with a tray of gin and tonics for you. No. They make life very, very tough. I mean, you've seen a little bit of it on sort of drugs, for example, where you've taken a very different view.
I've seen a lot of it, actually, funny enough, by just forming a coalition, which the establishment hates, by the way. But anyway, let's not go on that.
Yes, although they've worked rather well for Germany since 1945.
No, here they hate it.
But here they loathe it.
Because the two establishment parties...
So I took on the establishment, and so they necessarily... rather than going for the bull, they go for the man. Oh. But when it really changed was when, in 2004, it seemed obvious to me that UKIP had to move from being a party that talked about constitutional issues, democratic issues, issues of sovereignty. We had to embrace the immigration debate. And on the day that you and I were both elected together to the European Parliament...
2005? No,
1999,
sorry.
1999, same day.
Yep.
And, on all my literature in 1999, the word immigration didn't appear once because it wasn't an issue. But it became an issue when we let in 8, then 10 former communist countries, very much poorer than we are. So when I took on
Just on that, mention what you've used, do you think if the then Labour government had not opened the British labour market before other equivalent-sized economies did in 2004, the subsequent politics of European immigration would have been very different?
I remember walking out of the chamber that morning in early 2004 when we were asked as MEPs to vote to sort of give the final tick on the accession of 8 former communist countries. And there were just 3 British MEPs that voted against, and they were from UKIP. And I said to the other 2 fellas with me, that's the best day's work we've ever done in our lives, because it was obvious to me that there was going to be a huge,
backlash,
uncontrolled migratory flow. Now, the problem was this, that in many ways, the Powell speech of 68, the so-called Rivers of Blood speech of 68, had almost made it impossible to discuss immigration in a grown-up context. In fact, really, immigration and criticism of it had become the preserve of the National Front or the British National Party, and nobody in mainstream politics would dare to touch upon the issue. So I knew that by taking on this subject, that life was going to get very tough. What I didn't know is just how nasty it would be.
Nigel, just because I think we're going to return to some of these things, could I just ask you, though, because I think at this stage of this conversation, I'm quite interested about how you and your sort of family sort of felt about all of it. I mean, actually, by the way, I mean, just something occurred to me. I mean, both of our families your kids have British dad, mind you, as well, European mum. Would you say your kids feel as European as they do British? Do that? I mean,
no. I don't. No, they don't.
And do they speak different languages?
Oh, look, I mean, they're both, they both speak perfect German.
And my kids have got Spanish and British passports. Do they have German and British passports?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And that link to the German side of their family is clearly important to them, but their identity, if it comes to a football game, it's pretty clear which side they're actually going to support. Their mum may not. But that's pretty clear.
Just before we move on to the next bit, so this is about anger. You have used people's perhaps legitimate anger about the status quo very effectively. That's what... I mean, what would Nigel Farage be without anger? Did you use anger? Or did you riot anger? Did you provoke anger? Did you?
No.
Tell me about your attitude towards anger as in politics.
I've used humour a lot too. I mean, look at the stuff I've done in the European Parliament.
Yeah, but
it's designed
Yeah.
to make people smile as much as anything else.
It's also designed to make. I mean, when you've said things about, I don't know, married women are working women are worth less in the workplace, all this kind of stuff. I mean, if you said
Now,
things which
hang
are
on.
deeply provocative,
But again, you see, I mean, what a ludicrous situation. There I was speaking